Chapter 1. My name is India Opal Balloony, and the last summer, my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese, some white rice, and 2 tomatoes. I came back with a dog. This is what happened. I walked into the produce section of the Winn-Dixie grocery store to pick out 2 tomatoes. I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced, screaming and waving his arms around. "Who let a dog in here?" He kept on shouting, "Who let a dirty dog in here?" At first, I didn't see a dog. There was just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor, tomatoes and onions and green peppers. And there was what seemed like a whole army of Winn-Dixie employees running around and waving their arms, just the same as the store manager was waving his. And the dog came running around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly. He looked like he was having a real good time. His tongue was hanging out and wagging his tail. He skidded to a stop and smiled right at me. I'd never seen a dog in my life smile, but that's what he did. He pulled back his lips and showed me all his teeth. Then he wagged his tail so hard that he knocked some oranges off a display, and then went rolling everywhere, mixing with the tomatoes and onions and green peppers. The store manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog!" The dog went running over to the store manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs. You could tell that all he wanted to do was get face to face with the manager and thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department. But somehow he ended up knocking the manager over, and the manager must have been having a real bad day, because lying there on the floor, in front of everybody, he started to cry. The dog leaned over him, real concerned, and licked his face. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." "Wait a minute," I hollered. "That's my dog. Don't call the pound." All the Winn-Dixie employees turned around and looked at me. I knew I'd done something big and maybe stupid too, but I couldn't help it. Couldn't let that dog go to the pound. "Here, boy," I said. The dog stopped licking his manager's face and put his ears up in the air and looked at me, like he was trying to remember where he knew me from. "Here, boy," I said again, and then I figured that the dog was probably just like everybody else in the world, and that he would want to get called by a name. Only I didn't know what his name was. So I just said the first thing that came into my head. I said, "Here, Winn-Dixie!" The dog came trotting over to me just like he had been doing it his whole life. The manager sat up and gave me a hard stare, like maybe I was making fun of him. "His name," I said, "honest." The manager said, "Don't you know not to bring a dog into a grocery store?" "Yes, sir," I told him. "He got in my mistake. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "Come on, Winn-Dixie," I said to the dog. I started walking, and he followed along behind me as I went out of the produce department and down the cereal aisle, and I passed all the cashiers at the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him all over real careful, and he didn't look good. He was big but skinny. You could see his ribs. And there were bald patches all over him, places where he didn't have any fur at all. Mostly he looked like a big piece of old brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. "You're a mess," I told him. "I bet you don't belong to anybody." He smiled at me. He did that thing again where he pulled back his lips and showed me his teeth. He smiled so big that I made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, "I know I'm a mess. Isn't it funny?" It's hard not to immediately fall in love with a dog who has a good sense of humor. "Come on," I told him. "Let's see what Preacher says about you." The 2 of us, Winn-Dixie and me, started walking home. Chapter 2. That summer I found Winn-Dixie was alone also in the summer, and Preacher moved to Naomi, Florida. He could be the new preacher of the opening Barson's Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy's a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy, because he spends so much time preaching and thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach that it's in my mind I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India. That's how I know I got my first name, because he calls me by my second name, Opal. But because that's my mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him I got my name. I told him how I just now moved to Naomi. I told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even though he was distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. "But you know what?" I told Winn-Dixie. "You're a suffering dog, so maybe he'll take you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you." Winn-Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping or something was wrong with one of his back legs. I had to admit it, he stunk bad. He was an ugly dog, but I already loved him with all my heart. When I got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie he had to behave right and be quiet. This was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher, and I was good, a quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mr. Dweller's little yuppie Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him when we got to the trailer. He sit right down. He had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. The preacher was sitting in the living room, working on a little fold-out table. He had papers spread out all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always meant he was thinking hard. Daddy, I said. He said back. Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help the less fortunate than ourselves? He said. He rubbed his nose and looked around his papers. Well, I said, I found the less fortunate in the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him. I stared into the preacher real hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside his shell. In there, thinking about things, not ever sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering if this less fortunate could stay with us for a while. Finally, the preacher looked up at me and said, What are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn-Dixie! Winn-Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed. Then he came limping up the steps into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at his ribs and the matted up fern places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn-Dixie looked at the preacher and he pulled his back lips, showing the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth, and wagged his tail and knocked some preacher's paper off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered onto the floor. What did you call this dog? The preacher asked. Winn-Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke out his head of the shell. Well, said the preacher, he's a stray and I've never seen one. He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind the ears. And he's less fortunate, too, that's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher asked real soft to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. Well, the preacher said, I guess you found one.